Did you know that if California was a country, it would be on track to become the fourth biggest economy in the world in 2022, behind only the rest of the United States, China, and Japan? That is a pretty good accomplishment for a state which occupies only 4% of the total area of the country it is part of. So, what makes California so successful economically? Is it the year-round warm weather, thanks to its fortuitous geographical location and proximity to the coast? Or the large ports, which allow it to be the country's shipment gateway to the rest of the world? Or maybe it's the technology and entertainment industries, which help California attract and retain the brightest talent the world has to offer. Stay tuned as we explore these and other fascinating facts about this wonderful state. Before we dive into California's specific case, let's firstly explore the broader terminology and concepts which are handy for trying to make sense of the economics of countries and their constituent states. The size of a country's economy is often measured using something called the gross domestic product, which represents the economic value of all the work that the people of that country do in a given year. Now, everyone has the same number of hours in the year, but some countries are recognized as more productive than others at utilizing that time. This can be driven by three factors: the number of hours people actually work from among all the available calendar hours in a year, the number of people who work in that country or its workforce, and finally, the productivity of those people. Let's imagine two hypothetical countries of identical size in terms of both the territory and the populations they have. If country A has a larger labor workforce because, for example, it has a younger population with fewer retired workers, it would have an advantage over country B in terms of its economic productivity potential. To compensate for that, country B might implement a policy that allows people to work for up to 45 hours per week, as opposed to the more traditional 40, which can theoretically balance out its structural disadvantage due to its demographic makeup. If workers in both countries have the same productivity, country A and country B could end up with very similar economic performance records, despite the differences in the size of their workforce. Now, let's imagine that country A's workers are not only younger, but also more advanced and productive than their counterparts from country B. For example, country A's workforce is mostly made up of software engineers, and software as an industry is in its early phases of development, compared to other more traditional industries. This means that the world's level of saturation with software products is still relatively low, while the value these products bring is relatively high, as there are plenty of high-value problems that software is capable of solving, but hasn't yet gotten around to solving. In contrast, country B's workforce is made up of more traditional professionals, such as carpenters, car mechanics, and hospitality workers. The market for their services is quite saturated, which means that the value they generate per hour of work is significantly lower than their country A counterparts. This little anecdote illustrates the fundamental factors which drive a given geography's economic competitiveness vis-à-vis its counterparts, from either within the same country or internationally. Depending on the geography's unique mix of the size of its workforce, the number of productive hours per year, and the workforce's skills and productivity, it can be middle of the pack economically when compared to its peers, lag them, or, in the case of California, outperform. Now let's look at some numbers in order to understand which of the three factors are the biggest contributors to California's economic miracle. The best way to look at a situation like this is through a subset of peers, because this allows us to tease out what truly drives outperformance in a numerical sense. We selected the following comparison set for California: China, Japan, Germany, and the UK for countries, and Texas, New York, and Florida for states. Most of these geographies are similar in economic size to California, and therefore should provide useful results from this comparison. If we look at population numbers, we can see that China had around 1.4 billion people as of 2021, while Japan was about a tenth of that size, with 126 million people in the same year. Germany, in turn, was about two-thirds the size of Japan, with 83 million people, while the UK stood at a comparable figure of 67 million. State-wise, California stood at 39 million people, which is just under half the size of Germany. Texas, Florida, and New York stood at 30, 22, and 20 million people respectively. In comparison, the economic size of China was a massive $17.7 trillion in terms of its gross domestic product, or the value of the work performed by its people in 2021. Japan's GDP stood at around $4.9 trillion in the same year, while Germany's and the UK's landed at $4.2 and $3.2 trillion respectively. In comparison, California's gross state product was valued at $3.4 trillion in 2021, while Texas produced roughly $1.2 trillion of value, or only 60% as much as California. The state of New York's GSP was estimated at around $2 trillion, while Florida landed at a respectable $1.3 trillion in the same period. These numbers tell a fascinating story. China's population was 47 times the size of California's, but its GDP was only a factor of 5, which implies that California's workforce was significantly more productive, or 9 times as much to be exact. This, of course, presupposes that both workforces had a comparable amount of productive time per year, driven by things like the number of public holidays and the duration of the workweek, as well as labor force participation ratios, which we assume is true for the purpose of this video. The implications of this comparison are quite profound if you pause to think about it. Does this mean that a given Californian worker is almost 10 times as productive as one in China? Well, it would appear to be the case based on this analysis, at least when it comes to the monetary value of the work being performed by both workers at this particular point in time. In a similar but much less dramatic vein, the population of Japan is roughly 3 times the size of California's, but its GDP is only 40% higher. Germany and the UK have roughly twice as many people as California, but their economies are roughly the same size as the states. By a similar logic to China, it would appear that an average worker in California is roughly twice as productive as a typical representative of each of these countries, which is quite an interesting conclusion from this thought experiment. State-wise, California is ahead of both Texas and Florida when it comes to GSP per capita, but it is slightly behind the state of New York when it comes to this metric. So what makes the average Californian worker so productive economically when compared to both the international set of peers, as well as most other states in the US? Well, as discussed in our little theoretical example at the beginning of this video, we believe that a lot of it has to do with the industries that Californian workers are engaged in. It is not a secret that some of the most successful, innovative, and profitable companies in the world are based in California, including Apple, Alphabet, Visa, Intel, Disney, Cisco Systems, HP, Oracle, and numerous others. These companies often provide the best products and services in their respective industries, which tend to command higher prices and therefore profit margins. All other things being equal, this automatically translates into higher productivity for California's workers, which can be thought of as the value of the products and services a given worker produces per unit of time. Interestingly, many of the leading companies we just mentioned produce either services, such as advertising, or intangible goods, such as software or movies. All these products tend to be highly scalable, meaning that the work produced by the group of people who made them can be resold multiple times to a variety of different customers, with minimal additional production costs to do so. Think about a search engine which, after it was initially developed, costs comparable amounts of money to operate, whether they are 100 million or a billion people using it. Scalability is a major advantage for California's companies because it allows them to generate the kinds of super profits that most other countries can only dream of. Closely related to scalability is California's ability to export. Exports are like steroids for an economy because they expand the number of customers a given business can have compared to selling its wares only domestically. What's unique about California is that the state has figured out a way to export services on a truly global scale. Unlike cars, consumer electronics, or commodities, services used to be mainly a local offering, as they were tied to the person or the physical entity providing the service, such as a barber, a restaurant, or a bank branch. With the advent of software and virtual products, Californian companies can now sell their products to customers in every corner of the world, without ever having to leave their cozy San Francisco offices to do so. Another curious fact about California's service-based industry is that the main ingredients in creating these products are people's time and skills, rather than physical components or expensive machinery as in the case in more traditional sectors. According to GDP accounting conventions, the cost of physical components and equipment is often subtracted from the value of the goods and services produced in a given territory, as these components tend to be imported from outside the territory where they are cheaper to produce. And in the case of services and intangible goods, well, there isn't much to subtract, which only helps to further increase the economic productivity of people in those industries, at least on paper. All these factors have contributed to the incredible economic growth that California has experienced over the last few decades. No other geography in the world is home to this many companies which are at the cutting edge of a global technological revolution, which is redefining how humanity is going to live and work over the next several generations. And it's only natural the home of all this innovation becomes an economic superpower as a result. Of course, besides the hyper-productive industries we discussed, California also has other more traditional sectors. These include agricultural regions of the Central and Salinas Valleys, which are some of the most productive areas of this kind in the world, with more than 400 crops being grown across the state. Or the 12 ports, which enable California to earn significant income through enabling international shipments to and from the United States, with the Port of Los Angeles and the Port of Long Beach being the largest ports nationwide. California's people also work in its banks, schools and universities, hospitals and government entities, restaurants and supermarkets, power stations and logistics companies. But all of these are traditional industries with limited room left for super profits and, therefore, for true economic outperformance. The economic miracle of California, therefore, must come from elsewhere. And having had a look at its new generation service industry, we suspect we might know its origin.